The billionaire CEO had watched her daughter refuse to speak for 6 years, not to doctors, not to therapists, not even to her own mother. Then, in the middle of a crowded charity event, the little girl suddenly stepped toward a complete stranger, touched his scarred hand, and whispered a single word that made her mother drop her champagne glass. The stranger was a quiet single father named Callum Mercer, a man who had spent years hiding from his past, and nobody in that room knew that beneath his ordinary clothes was the identity of a former Navy SEAL who had once survived the kind of mission that changed a person forever. If you believe that kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances can change a life, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel, because sometimes the person who saves a broken heart is the one who has spent years trying to hide his own. The charity gala was being held in the bright glass atrium of the Harrington Foundation headquarters, where sunlight poured through enormous windows and reflected across polished marble floors. Wealthy investors, politicians, celebrities, and business leaders moved through the room carrying expensive glasses and speaking about millions as casually as ordinary people discussed groceries. At the center of it all stood Vivienne Harrington, the 38-year-old billionaire CEO whose technology company had transformed her into one of the youngest and most powerful women in America. She wore confidence like armor, but anyone who looked carefully could see the exhaustion beneath it. Her greatest battle had nothing to do with business, competition, or money. It was her 9-year-old daughter, Elodie, who stood beside her in a pale blue dress, staring silently at the crowd. Elodie had been born with profound hearing loss, and although she could make sounds and had learned some speech through years of therapy, she had gradually withdrawn from verbal communication after a traumatic medical procedure when she was 3. For 6 years, her mother had watched words disappear from her daughter's world. Vivienne had hired specialists from across the country, paid for private tutors, arranged therapies, and even built a sensory room inside their mansion, but nothing had brought her little girl back to the confident child she had once been. Vivienne loved her daughter desperately, but her love had slowly become tangled with fear. She wanted to protect Elodie from every disappointment, every cruel stare, every person who might misunderstand her. Without realizing it, she had begun protecting her so fiercely that she was also keeping her isolated. That afternoon, while Vivienne spoke with investors, Elodie slipped away from her side and wandered toward a quieter section of the atrium where volunteers were helping children from a veterans rehabilitation program. There, kneeling beside a small boy who had knocked over a wooden puzzle, was Callum Mercer. He was 36, broad-shouldered, calm, and dressed in a simple navy button-down shirt and dark trousers. Nothing about him suggested wealth. He worked as a maintenance supervisor at a community rehabilitation center and raised his 8-year-old daughter, Maisie, alone. His face carried the kind of stillness that came from having seen things most people never would. A faint scar crossed his left eyebrow, and another disappeared beneath his collar. He had learned long ago how to keep his emotions behind his eyes. Elodie stopped several feet away and watched him help the boy gather the puzzle pieces. Callum noticed her but did not rush toward her. Instead, he simply smiled and held up one of the wooden pieces, letting her decide whether she wanted to come closer. Elodie approached slowly. She pointed at the piece, then at the puzzle. Callum understood immediately and handed it to her. When she fitted it into place, he gave her a quiet thumbs up. Something about that simple gesture made her smile. Vivienne noticed her daughter interacting with the stranger and immediately walked toward them, ready to intervene. But before she could reach them, Elodie looked directly at Callum. Her lips trembled. Her breathing changed. Then, for the first time in 6 years, she forced out a word. It was quiet, imperfect, and barely audible, but it was unmistakably a word. She whispered, "Safe." The glass slipped from Vivienne's hand and shattered against the marble floor. For a moment, nobody moved. The music continued, people continued talking, and a waiter hurried forward to clean the broken glass, but Vivienne heard nothing. She could only stare at her daughter. Elodie had not spoken to her doctors. She had not spoken to her therapists. She had barely spoken to Vivienne since the previous winter. Yet she had looked at a complete stranger and said one word that carried an entire world inside it. Safe. Callum looked startled, almost frightened, as though the word had reached somewhere inside him that he had spent years locking away. He crouched down to Elodie's level and gently pointed toward her mother, reminding her that Vivienne was there. Elodie turned and reached for her mother's hand. Vivienne took it with shaking fingers, tears already filling her eyes. She wanted answers. She wanted to know who this man was, why her daughter trusted him, and how he had managed to connect with her in less than 5 minutes when specialists had failed for years. Her first instinct was suspicion. She had spent her life believing that people approached her because they wanted something. Money. Influence. Access. A favor. She could not understand why an ordinary maintenance worker would have any reason to care about her daughter. Callum did not ask for a photograph, a business card, or an introduction. When Vivienne offered him one, he politely declined. He simply said that Elodie seemed like a wonderful child and that he hoped she would keep finding ways to express herself. That answer bothered Vivienne more than anything else. Over the following weeks, Elodie repeatedly asked to visit the rehabilitation center where Callum worked. Vivienne initially resisted, but Elodie became withdrawn whenever she refused. Eventually, Vivienne agreed to accompany her. What she saw there changed something inside her. Callum did not treat Elodie as fragile. He never spoke loudly at her or looked at her with pity. He communicated through gestures, drawings, expressions, and patience. He allowed her to choose the activity. Sometimes they worked with puzzles. Sometimes they built small wooden models. Sometimes they simply sat at a table while Callum repaired broken toys. Vivienne began noticing something else. Callum seemed unusually observant. He always positioned himself where he could see every entrance. He noticed when a chair had been moved several inches. He knew exactly where the first aid kit was without asking. When a glass display suddenly tipped near a group of children, he caught it before anyone else even reacted. Once, when a volunteer accidentally activated a loud emergency alarm, Callum immediately checked the children, counted them, and calmly directed everyone away from the source before the staff understood what had happened. Vivienne finally asked him where he had learned to react like that. Callum became quiet. Then he told her that he had served in the military and had worked in situations where paying attention could mean the difference between life and death. He did not say more. Vivienne sensed there was a story beneath the answer, but she respected his silence. What she did not know was that Callum Mercer had once been a Navy SEAL. Years earlier, he had served on a classified overseas operation that ended in tragedy. His closest teammate, Nathaniel Brooks, had died while Callum was trying to evacuate him. Callum survived, but he carried the memory like a wound that never closed. After returning home, he married his college sweetheart, Evelyn. They had their daughter, Maisie, but the marriage eventually collapsed under the weight of Callum's nightmares, emotional distance, and inability to explain what he had seen. Evelyn moved across the country, leaving Callum to raise Maisie. He never blamed her. In his mind, she had deserved a life that was not controlled by someone else's battlefield. Callum had left the military quietly. He refused medals, interviews, and public recognition. He wanted only an ordinary life. But ordinary life had never felt entirely safe to him. Then Elodie had looked into his eyes and whispered the word he had spent years desperately needing to hear himself. Safe. The growing bond between Elodie and Callum unsettled Vivienne's business partner, Graham Whitmore, who had spent years trying to convince Vivienne that emotional attachments made powerful people vulnerable. Graham began feeding her doubts. He suggested that Callum might be manipulating her daughter to gain access to the Harrington family. Vivienne dismissed the accusation at first, but the fear took root. One afternoon, after Callum brought Elodie home from the rehabilitation center, Vivienne confronted him. She accused him of hiding something. Callum did not become angry. Instead, he admitted that he was hiding something, but not what she thought. He told her that his military past had made him uncomfortable around wealthy people and cameras because attention could expose parts of his life he had deliberately kept private. Vivienne demanded to know what he had done. Callum finally told her. He had been a Navy SEAL. Vivienne froze. The revelation did not make him seem more impressive. It made him seem more human. She realized the scars, the vigilance, the silence, and the way he studied every room were not signs of arrogance. They were remnants of survival. But Graham's manipulation had already gone too far. He secretly arranged for an old military photograph of Callum to be circulated among several investors, accompanied by insinuations that Callum had been involved in a classified incident overseas. Rumors spread that Vivienne had allowed a dangerous man into her daughter's life. The board demanded that she remove Callum from all contact with Elodie. Vivienne was furious, but fear returned. For the first time, she wondered whether protecting Elodie meant letting Callum go. When she told Elodie that she could no longer see him, her daughter broke down. She grabbed a notebook and wrote furiously that Callum had never hurt her, never forced her to speak, and never treated her like she was broken. Then, with tears running down her cheeks, Elodie wrote something that shattered Vivienne's heart: "He listens even when I don't talk." Vivienne stared at those words for a long time. She realized that she had spent years paying people to make her daughter speak, while Callum had simply taken the time to listen. The following afternoon, Vivienne went to Callum's small home. She found him sitting on the front porch while Maisie worked on a school project beside him. The house was modest, warm, and filled with ordinary things. There were drawings on the refrigerator, children's books on the table, and photographs of Callum holding Maisie when she was a toddler. Vivienne finally understood that he had never been trying to enter her world. He had been building his own small world around the people he loved. She apologized. Callum told her that she did not need to apologize for being afraid. She only needed to decide whether fear was going to control her choices. Those words stayed with Vivienne. The next morning, Vivienne faced the board and refused their demand. She revealed that Callum had served honorably as a Navy SEAL and had received commendations for saving members of his team, but she also made it clear that his military history was not the reason she trusted him. She trusted him because her daughter did. Then she did something even more difficult. She admitted publicly that she had failed her daughter in one important way. She had loved Elodie so fiercely that she had confused protection with control. She had tried to build a world where nothing could hurt her child, instead of teaching her that she could survive the things that did. Graham's influence collapsed when an internal investigation uncovered that he had deliberately spread the military rumors to weaken Vivienne's position and gain control of additional company shares. He was removed from the board. But the greatest victory happened somewhere far more ordinary. That afternoon, Elodie sat with Callum and Maisie at a picnic table outside the rehabilitation center. Sunlight warmed the grass around them. Elodie had a small notebook in front of her. She looked at Callum, then at Vivienne, who was sitting nearby. Slowly, carefully, Elodie spoke again. This time she said, "Mom." Vivienne covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Elodie reached for her hand. Then she looked toward Callum and added another word. "Friend." Callum lowered his head, overcome by emotion. For a man who had survived combat, loss, divorce, loneliness, and years of believing he no longer deserved peace, that single word was more powerful than any medal he had ever received. Months passed, and Elodie's progress continued. She did not suddenly become a perfectly confident speaker. Some days were difficult. Some days she communicated through signs, drawings, or silence. But nobody measured her worth by how many words she could produce anymore. Vivienne learned to slow down. Callum learned that his past did not have to define his future. Maisie gained a little sister-like friend, and Elodie gained something she had never truly possessed before, a sense that the world could contain people who would wait for her instead of demanding that she hurry. Vivienne and Callum also grew closer, but their relationship developed slowly, carefully, and honestly. There was no instant romance, no magical cure, and no pretending that either of them had forgotten their wounds. They simply became two people who understood each other's scars. Vivienne taught Callum that vulnerability was not weakness. Callum taught Vivienne that love was not measured by how much control you exercised, but by how much freedom you were willing to give someone you loved. One bright afternoon, nearly a year after the charity gala, Vivienne stood in the same atrium where everything had begun. This time there were no investors demanding explanations and no rumors surrounding her family. There was simply a small celebration for the children supported by her foundation. Elodie walked onto the stage holding Callum's hand. She looked at the crowd, took a breath, and spoke into the microphone. Her voice was soft and imperfect, but she did not hide it. She said that sometimes people think silence means someone has nothing to say. Sometimes, she explained, silence simply means a person is waiting for someone patient enough to listen. Vivienne cried openly. Callum stood beside her, his eyes shining. And when Elodie finished, the entire room rose to its feet. The applause was not for the billionaire CEO. It was not for the former Navy SEAL. It was for a little girl who had found her voice in her own time, a mother who had learned to let go of fear, and a broken man who finally discovered that surviving was not the same thing as living. Before we reach the final moment of this story, leave a meaningful comment and tell us what touched you most: Elodie's courage, Vivienne's willingness to change, or Callum's decision to stop running from his past. Sometimes your words can become hope for someone silently fighting their own battle. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. As the afternoon sunlight streamed through the glass ceiling, Elodie walked between Vivienne and Callum, holding both their hands. No one could have predicted that a billionaire CEO would one day find her greatest lesson in a little girl who struggled to speak, or that a former Navy SEAL would find his peace in the trust of a child who had barely spoken for years. But life had a way of bringing wounded people together. Sometimes the person who needs saving is not the one everyone notices. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one brave enough to admit they are afraid. And sometimes a single word from a child can remind an entire family that healing does not begin when the pain disappears. It begins when someone finally feels safe enough to hope again.